Hey, we got a call about a male hitting a female and the two of them getting in this vehicle and taking off.
So
Hi, I'm calling. I'm right on the corner of Main Street by Moonflower, and we're driving by, and I'd like to report a domestic dispute. Florida with a white van, Florida license plate, white van, gentleman,
Where's
about
it at?
5'6" beard. They just drove off. They're going down Main Street. They made a right onto Main Street from Moonflower.
Or what were they doing?
Cooperative, but what'd you say?
What were they doing?
We drove by, and the gentleman was slapping the girl.
He was slapping her?
Yes, and then we stopped. They ran up and down the sidewalk. He proceeded to hit her.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So this is episode 8 in the deep dive series dealing with the Moab incident. Today is also the 1-year anniversary when Brian and Gabby left on their van life adventure, their summer epic through America's national parks about a year ago. And obviously that came to a very tragic end for both of them. So in terms of this deep dive, obviously it's important to see each of these deep dives in context, which means to be aware of the continuity running from one deep dive to the next. And so obviously you're welcome to go through the previous deep dives, whether it's number 7 or even going further if you haven't already. But it's also important to look at a deep dive in isolation, to look at one completely on its own and ask, what's wrong with this picture? And that's what we want to do in this deep dive number 8. What could the officers, or indeed Gabby, have done differently? In this episode, I want you to watch the 3 minutes and 20 seconds following the 20-minute mark. That's where we are in terms of our analysis. Thus, up to approximately 23 minutes and 30 seconds. And think critically, what could the officers have done differently?
What part of California is that? I'm from town just outside Sequoia National Park. If you're going to be going through there,
We'll get good in the way of outdoors.
go ahead. But no, it wasn't too bad at all.
So I just phone with one of the two witnesses, and I reported it. You want me to tell you what he said?
Yeah, real quick.
Do you mind hanging with him for a minute? So, get away from both of them. So, he said that he never saw the male strike the female. He saw the male trying to lock her out of the vehicle. She even told us that he was trying to lock her out, told her to go take a walk, so that she was trying to get in. She eventually couldn't get in and actually clawed her way in through the driver's door. He says, I don't understand why she's doing that. Well, I think it's because it was the only door that wasn't locked that she could get through. So she's trying to get in over him. He's trying to disengage from her. I guess he hung her backpack on the back probably so she would have her shit, so that he didn't have to engage with her. Everything she's saying is the same thing. I haven't heard what he said, but if that's what he said, it's also what the witness is saying. The witness says, I never saw him hit her. I saw him shove her, but I couldn't tell if it was an aggression against her or a defense against her, as far as her, being the aggressor. So at this point, unless the guy's screaming that he needs to go to jail and did something to this girl, it sounds to me like she is the primary aggressor.
Yeah. Now,
the problem with her being the primary aggressor is in incidents of domestic assault, be it a male or be it a female, we shall arrest. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to go to jail. We can do a citation if it meets one of 3 criterion, which one of them is that we can ensure that they're not going to further risk each other's safety. But the problem with that is they live in the same vehicle.
that's what I was going to say. The other part of it is
there was actually an injury too to the victim, which is him.
Right, and I'm getting conflicting stories about why they hit the curb up here.
What did he say why he hit the curb?
Well, I've watched, this is what I saw first. Saw him cross the double yellow. I was doing 42 miles an hour. I was, probably 2 car lengths behind him, tapping my wheels at him, trying to get his attention. They knew I was behind him. And then after he crossed the double yellow, he merged over into the right lane, and then out of nowhere, just boom, and hit the curb.
So did he tell you why?
He said that she grabbed the wheel and turned it real hard. She said that she was hitting him in the arm. So
Sounds legit. I mean, I'm sure if I'm driving and my arm's on the wheel and I'm getting hit in the arm, I'm probably pulling out the wheel.
yeah,
And I'm sure it was a little of both, and usually the truth is somewhere between. He's probably trying not to say that he hit her because he probably doesn't want her charged with assault, domestic assault. He probably would rather say she pulled the wheel than hit him.
yeah.
You know what I mean? So, unfortunately for her, we cannot treat, just because he's bigger and stronger, and even if he's not willing to press charges, we can't treat this differently than if it was a male on female violence.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to charge her. And we can do a citation if there's some arrangement that can be made to separate them. And then we have to let them know that there's no contact order in effect. And then we have to let him know the only way to drop it is to go into the police department during business hours and fill out a waiver, which, by the way, what's
It's
today?
too late
Thursday?
today.
So it won't be till tomorrow. I know, they're till noon, I think.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure he's going to want to drop it.
Well, the other part of it is they said that they've been on 4 or 5 months that they've been living out of this van together.
Well, this is really bad news. Let's talk to him first.
Now, in the same way that the officers on the scene need to remember what is the point, what is the reason why they were summoned to this incident in the first place? Like, why are they there? What is the question? What is the problem that they need to be dealing with? We need to remember that as well in terms of why are we here? Why are we re-examining this? And somebody left a comment saying, it's very interesting to analyze Brian's body language, etc. But where I have a problem is where hindsight bias comes into play. There's no way they could have foreseen that 2 weeks later, one would horribly kill the other. And she goes on to write, that doesn't even follow the trajectory and escalation of 99.9999% of DVA relationships. Well, that is not what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to accuse these officers of wrongdoing, especially in hindsight. We're trying to learn and apply the lesson. It's pointless following this analysis only to come away with this idea that nothing was done wrong, nothing can be improved upon, and nothing was overlooked. The point is, we want to be more sensitive to the nuance and try to figure out how mistakes are made in a general sense, but also specific to the Moab incident. Not only here, but in our own lives too. How do we make mistakes? How are emotions compromising our ability to see what is obvious? The other aspect to bear in mind is that Brian is a very soon-to-be murderer. Can we see that? Can we not see that? Should we be able to, or shouldn't we? If your argument is that we can't, then I think an argument can be made that if true crime is headed your way, there's nothing you can do about it. There are no signs or symptoms. There are no tides or processes. There are no patterns, no red flags, nothing to help us on our way. Now, the same person who made this comment made a comment in the live that I did with Kathleen Hale that the Mary Piglets incident triggered something, but I see it totally differently. It wasn't just one trigger, it was 100 triggers over not just one day or one afternoon, but many days, many weeks, many months, even across several years. That there was a long process filled with warning flags going all the way back to their school days, but none so obvious as having to explain themselves to the police at the side of the road. And as a result of members of the public, that's plural, seeing something that disturbed them, seeing something that was obviously not right with this couple. Gabby knew what the red flags were. She was there, she was in the relationship. She was crying, certainly during the Moab incident. Brian knew them. He was also a participant. But there's a difference between knowing and recognizing. And that's where we come in. Can we know and recognize? And can we realize the basic thing of escalating increasingly dangerous behavior and then also apply that sense of recognition in our everyday lives? Can we? Should we? Now, with that out of the way, before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Bear in mind, you can also watch the preceding 7 deep dives at a playlist link in the description. And let's get started. So I'm going to play the whole 3 minutes, 30 seconds once again. But before running through those 3 minutes and change a second time, I I want to put it through 3 filters. I want you to think about these 3 minutes through the following 3 filters. The first one is context. We don't need a heck of a lot of context here besides the fact that at the moment Pratt joins Robbins and Park Ranger Ryan Kroll at 2019. Robbins, Kroll and Brian are kind of engaging in small talk. It's kind of affable, it's friendly. In fact, Brian is smiling broadly and laughing with an open mouth while standing with his hands in a fig leaf position. It's also already quite clear at this point that Robbins is sort of taking Brian's side, even before consulting with Pratt. The other thing to note is that although Brian has won over both officers, coming across as calm, casual, good-natured and congenial, the reality is it's all an act. It's manipulative. Can't they see that? Shouldn't they be able to see that? One of the most obvious things with the Moab incident is the disconnect between Gabby crying, Gabby being very emotional, and Brian apparently being casual, light-hearted, even happy. What's wrong with that picture? Isn't it clear that something is clearly wrong? So you have Gabby, who is emotional and authentic. Brian is first somber and apologetic, but then inappropriately joking about the incident and trying to hide his awkwardness. Brian is inauthentic, but the officers don't seem to notice. When Brian lies about the phone, he says he doesn't have a phone and later on he does, the officers don't seem to notice. One clue to this is that the moment Officer Pratt comes over, Brian's demeanor goes from openly smiling to becoming panicked and guarded. He remains frozen in the fig leaf position, appearing to lean casually with his left shoulder against the van, cross-legged, while turning his head all the way around to see what the officer who has been talking to Gabby has to say. It looks awkward because Brian is feeling anxious, but trying not to show it. That brings us to the second point. Sometimes the obvious thing isn't so obvious. When Pratt and Robbins consult privately, 2 obvious things seem to elude them. Firstly, they seem to have forgotten what the original question was. In other words, why have they been summoned to the scene? What are they investigating to begin with? Now, in fairness, what complicated this incident was that there were multiple incidents within the incident, and also multiple reports and multiple witnesses. In reverse order, there was Brian driving over the speed limit, the van hitting the curb and coming to an abrupt stop, and the circumstances surrounding that, and then also the Moonflower altercation, which was reported as alternately Gabby hitting Brian and Brian hitting Gabby. But the bottom line is that Officer Robbins' involvement was elicited as a result of a 911 call to the Grand County Dispatch Center at 16:39 and 16 seconds. The caller, as we played at the beginning of this clip, called to report a, quote, gentleman slapping the girl, end quote, and then proceeded to hit her. Not only slapping, but also hitting. Also running after one another on the sidewalk. It's also very likely intertextual that the Moab incident and the Sped Creek camp, what they had in common was Gabby and Brian arguing over Gabby's phone. That is explicitly mentioned in the investigative report, that Brian was trying to take Gabby's phone from her. Now, if the officers thought that this wasn't really a very serious thing, it was not necessary to charge any of them or detain any of them, the caller was so compelled by what he saw, besides calling 911, he took a photo of the van's license plate and was able to provide the make, model, and other characteristics of the van. Besides that, there was also another caller. So you have several witnesses urging the police to intervene, only for the police not really to intervene. In other words, this was a detailed, authentic, and likely accurate report. In sum, the accusation was that Brian had repeatedly assaulted Gabby. I think if Gabby had hit Brian, there wouldn't have been a call. In fact, if you remember, the first words Officer Pratt spoke to Brian, and they were played at the beginning of this video, when he approached Brian's driver's side door, was repeating this accusation, which was still fresh in his mind. And what did Brian do? Well, Brian leaned away from him to address the park ranger, seemingly dodging Pratt's question. And that was the first sign that they were dealing with a devious and manipulative person. Soon after that, Pratt left Brian, having left his question unresolved, and then went to speak to Gabby. Gabby then reframed the officer's question of whether Brian hit her to say, "I guess, but I hit him first." It's from this point that Officer Pratt seems to have taken Gabby's lead and emphasized her part in the altercation. In sum, the officers were called to the scene because witnesses saw a male hitting a female, and that ought to have been the focus of the investigation, particularly when speaking to Brian. The second obvious but not so obvious aspect was that while Pratt and Robbins are consulting one another, basically sharing their intel, the only female officer on scene is standing in the background. She's right there. Although the officers would later claim to be trying not to be sexist in their approach, a great way to have achieved this, getting another person's view on what was taking place, would have been to consult Park Ranger Melissa Holes before or while making their decision. Just get another person's view on this, someone else who has spoken to Gabby. Instead, on their way to breaking the news to Brian that he's the victim, both officers bypass Officer Holes without a word passing between them. They walk right by this officer and don't ask her for her input. What should also be said is Holes could have at some point reached out to one or both of the officers to share her insights. It's easy to say this in hindsight. Holes had no reason to know or believe that things would turn out the way that they did. On the other hand, from an interview she gave, she may well have had a reason to believe things would end in tears. The article is titled, "I Can Still Hear Her Voice. Archer's Park Ranger warned Gabby Petito her relationship seemed toxic." Well, couldn't she have conveyed that to the officers? And that brings us to the third and final filter, which is the scout mindset. The main issue with the Moab incident seems to be a combination of confirmation bias, which is referenced in the investigative report, and a lack of investigative curiosity. Besides this, the officers went off brief, forgetting what the primary aspect of the investigation was. One could also say that they were emotionally compromised in some way, not only by their own experiences, but by Brian and Gabby, and that a stricter application of the law could have, and would have, saved both their lives. In the end, as reported by Kathleen Hales in her Vanity Fair article, quote, "They decided," that's the officers, "that Gabby had been the primary aggressor in her altercation with Brian. Pratt joined Brian at the van, pointed a jaunty finger at him and announced, 'You are the victim of a DV,' causing Brian to laugh out loud. Gabby's crying, Brian is laughing out loud, and the officers don't seem to notice that what is wrong with this picture. People will often say in true crime that demeanor is it's a too subjective way to decide guilt or innocence. In fact, in our own personal lives, in reality, it's one of the best tools that we have at our disposal. But do we know how to use them? Are we using them? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.